is shining. Thy light shall guide me in the narrow way. Precept and promise, law and love combine me, till I shall vanish in eternal day. Sing number 583. Number 583. Excuse me. Let's sing. Sing to me of heaven, sing the song of peace. From the toils that bind me, it will bring release. Burdens will be lifted that are pressing so. Showers of great blessing o'er my heart will flow. Sing to me of heaven, let me fondly dream of its golden glory, of its perfect gleam. Sing to me when shadows of the evening fall. Sing to me of heaven's sweetest song of all. Sing to me of heaven as I walk alone, dreaming of the comrades that so long have gone. In a fairer region among the angel throng, they are happy as they sing that old sweet song. Sing to me of heaven, let me fondly dream of its golden glory, of its perfect gleam. Sing to me when shadows of the evening fall. Sing to me of heaven's sweetest song of all. Sing to me of heaven tenderly and low, till the shadows for me rise and swiftly go. When my heart is weary, when the day is long, sing to me of heaven, sing that old sweet song. Sing to me of heaven, let me fondly dream of its golden glory, of its perfect gleam. Sing to me when shadows of the evening fall. Sing to me of heaven's sweetest song of all. I guess we're dismissed to class.
I'd like to welcome everyone here tonight. I get sidetracked a lot. Maybe I can get this on, and if you hadn't noticed, I chase rabbits when we talk. And I got sidetracked this week. So this is probably going to be a lesson from the book of John, not more of a chronological verse-by-verse study. And it may get worse as we go on. I may end up that way. But almost a year ago, Rita asked me a question. about the difference between soul and spirit. And I didn't have a good answer for her. The answer was right. They're used almost entirely interchangeable within the New Testament and to some degree the Old. So it's hard to tell a difference, though there may be some subtle differences. And one of the things I ran across as we're studying in John was something that I mentioned. I made a note of it when we were studying chapter 4 about worshiping in truth and spirit. And I kind of put off in detail, I commented on that, but I put off in detail a discussion of that because I wasn't really prepared for that. So, quick look at the 3 slides that we always get. Gospel of John points to the deity of Jesus more than the other Gospels. It uses believe in all of its forms more than all the other Gospels combined, and presents signs that enable us to believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And that believing those things, we have life in his name. We talked a little bit about this. We had a study in basically the chronology of the crucifixion and the Passover meal. And this kind of came up out of our look in chapter 14 and 15 of the Passover meal. This one, we talked a little bit that he was getting about ready to give them a commission. This occurred after his resurrection. But we look at him in the Passover meal giving them some instructions that they're going to need later, some information. We talked about him saying in 14, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. We discussed some of that. He talked about I and my Father are one, which kind of has a bearing on basically the relationship of Jesus and the Father, and we talked a little bit about that. We'll probably talk some more about that as a lesson from John. But then he says, if you love me, keep my commandments. And this drew me back to chapter 4. Maybe it didn't draw you back, but it drew me back to chapter 4 when he's talking to the woman in the well, the Samaritan woman at the well. And she asks a question of him, or makes a statement concerning where their fathers worshipped in Mount Gerizim and the Jews in Jerusalem, and kind of implies a question, okay, who's right? And Jesus answers her in verse 21 through 24. And Jesus says to her, woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know. What we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour is coming, and now is, the true worshiper will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. And the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. And so what does it mean to worship in spirit and truth? Well, the truth is probably the easy part. We worship according to what God tells us. We worship according to what he tells us to do, his commands, without additions or deletions. And that's easy enough to understand in these verses, particularly John 12 and 48, which, if any of you have listened to the radio show, you maybe have that one memorized by now. But he says, he who rejects me and does not receive my words has that which judges him. The word that I have spoken will judge him in the last day. That's going to be the standard by which we're measured. So what happens with this? When we go back to this, what is he really doing or trying to say here? And there's been a lot written about this. I invite you to go look about what's written on it. It struck me this way. You may have a different opinion. He's making a comparison here. He's making a contrast. And the contrast is between their worship under the old law and worshiping under the gospel that Jesus brings and the apostles bring. And so he's making contrast here. He says, woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. Now, those are physical locations. And the worship that they were doing was more or less ordered around physical ceremonies and things that they did. Offering sacrifices, wearing certain things. The old law brought it to them in the forefront in physical things. And he's saying, you're not going to do that anymore. But the hour is coming now is when the true worshiper will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. Well, what's one of the characteristics of the Spirit? To worship him in spirit might mean a little bit different than the Spirit or your Spirit or God's Spirit, but kind of implied to me that these spirits are going to be taking part in the worship. And one of the characteristics of these spirits that we run into is they're not. Is this mic?
They can hear you on the live feed.
Okay. Are we having technical difficulties? I guess it would help to turn it on. Can you hear me now? There's something that we can't see. And sure enough, it's interesting in verse 24, God is spirit. Well, can we see God? I had a conversation years and years ago with a gentleman by the name of Fred Shoemaker. He used to preach here. It was back toward the beginning. And if I understood Fred's position, because God is spirit and only spirit, you can't see God. And yet I come across the account of God placing Moses in the cleft of the rock and says, I'm going to pass by and you're going to see my backside. So God has an appearance or can appear if he wishes, so he can have an appearance. The question is God only spirit? Is there something else to God? This verse may not militate that God is only spirit. It does not say God is only spirit. It just says God is spirit. Does God have a soul? And I'm not going to answer that question tonight. I'm going to point you to go look in the Old Testament, do an Englishman's search on the Hebrew word for soul, and you're going to find about at least 6, maybe more, references that God mentions his soul. So what's the difference between spirit and soul? And that comes back to your question, Rita. What are we talking about here when we say we're going to worship in spirit? And I think on the top level, what Jesus is saying here is you're not going to worship him in a physical way like the Old Testament law. You're going to worship him in a different way that's not as associated with the physicality. You're going to